And then my gaze flickered lower, just for a second, just long enough to catch the unmistakable evidence of it. Heat surged through me so fast it made my breath hitch. My stomach clenched, my fingers tightening around the counter. I shouldn't have looked. But now the knowledge was there, growing in his pants. The storm rolled in just after dusk, thick clouds swallowing the city skyline in a restless shroud of gray. From the floor-to-ceiling windows of our penthouse, I watched the first streaks of lightning split the sky, followed by the low, guttural growl of thunder. The wind howled between the high-rise buildings, rattling glass and sending sheets of rain cascading down like a living curtain. I had always loved storms. They made the world feel smaller, more intimate. But tonight, I wasn't alone. Behind me, I could hear the ice clinking in a crystal tumbler, the slow swirl of whiskey against glass. My stepson, Aiden, was lounging on the velvet sofa, his long legs stretched out, the casual sprawl of a man too young to understand consequences. He had arrived earlier that afternoon, freshly back from his law school semester, his presence filling the penthouse with a different kind of energy, something restless, something sharp. "It's really coming down out there," he murmured, his voice low, thoughtful. "Might be the worst one this season." I turned to face him. Even in the dim, golden glow of the recessed lighting, he looked effortlessly put together, an expensive sweater clinging to the lean lines of his torso, dark hair falling just a bit over his forehead. He had his father's sharp features, but none of his coldness. Aiden always looked at me too directly, too openly, as if he were waiting for me to say something I never would. I gave him a small smile. "It'll pass. It always does." As if to mock me, the power cut out. The entire penthouse plunged into darkness. The hum of the refrigerator, the gentle drone of the central AC, gone. For a moment there was only silence, thick and absolute, followed by the distant wail of car alarms set off by the lightning strike. I inhaled sharply. Aiden let out a low chuckle. "Well, that's dramatic." I heard him shift on the couch, and then there was the familiar click of his phone unlocking. A second later, the pale glow of the screen illuminated his face. "Looks like the whole block's out," he mused. "Probably the whole street." I sighed, rubbing my arms. Without power, the temperature in the penthouse would drop quickly, and the floor-to-ceiling windows did little to keep out the chill. "You cold?" Aiden asked. I hesitated, but he was already moving. I heard him rummage around before a warm weight settled over my shoulders, one of the plush throws from the couch. "Thanks," I murmured. "Let me get some candles," he said, disappearing into the kitchen. Left alone, I sank onto the couch, pulling the blanket tighter. The darkness made everything feel closer, more intimate. The usual barriers of space and propriety felt thinner, more fragile. A few moments later, soft light flickered across the room as Aiden returned, setting candles on the coffee table. The golden glow made his features look sharper, his eyes darker. He sat down beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of him, the slight scent of his cologne. "It's kinda nice like this," he said, leaning back, his gaze locked onto mine. I let out a breathless laugh. "You think so?" He tilted his head. "Yeah, no distractions, no emails, no calls, just this." There was something in his tone, something unreadable. I shifted, suddenly too aware of the way my silk robe clung to me, the way the candlelight danced over my skin. "You should probably go to bed soon," I said lightly. "We don't know when the power will be back." Aiden smirked, slow and knowing. "You want to get rid of me already?" Before I could answer, he reached for the bottle of whiskey on the table, pouring another glass. He took a slow sip, then glanced at me, a flicker of mischief in his gaze. "Let's play a game," he said. I hesitated. "A game?" "Truth or dare," he said, setting his drink down. I let out a breathless laugh. "What are we, teenagers?" He shrugged, but his eyes gleamed. "It's just a way to pass the time." Something in my stomach tightened. The air between us felt charged, thick with something I didn't want to name, but the storm howled outside and the penthouse was too dark, too still. I swallowed. "Fine," I said, "but just one round." Aiden's lips curled into something almost dangerous. "Truth or dare?" he asked. I licked my lips. "Truth." His gaze never wavered. "Tell me something you've never told anyone." The air between us crackled like the storm outside, and before I could stop myself, I did. Aiden's gaze was steady, patient. He swirled the whiskey in his glass, the ice clinking softly. He wasn't pushing, not exactly, but he was waiting. I should have laughed it off, picked something harmless, something inconsequential. But the dark had a way of unraveling defenses. The candlelight flickered, casting shifting shadows across his face, and before I could stop myself, the words slipped free. "I'm lonely." It came out barely above a whisper, but I saw how his expression changed, how the teasing glint in his eyes softened into something deeper, something unreadable. I immediately regretted saying it. "That's a dangerous confession," he murmured, tilting his head slightly. I forced a small smile, trying to pull back. "It's not a confession, it's just a feeling." He exhaled, leaning back against the couch, studying me. The candlelight made everything feel heavier, more intimate. "And does my father know?" I let out a breathless laugh. "Your father barely notices anything that isn't in his emails." The words felt bitter on my tongue. My husband, Aiden's father, was always working, always traveling, always too busy for anything beyond surface-level conversations. He loved in absence, in extravagant gifts and empty promises. Aiden didn't look surprised. He had grown up with the same man, after all. "I always wondered," he mused, his voice lower now, "what it must be like for you." I swallowed, suddenly uncomfortable with how closely he was watching me. "Aiden, we should—" "My turn," he interrupted smoothly, setting his drink down. I hesitated. "I thought we were only playing one round." He gave me a slow, knowing smirk. "Let's go one more." I should have stopped. I should have made up an excuse, told him it was late, that I was tired, but the air between us felt too charged, too fragile to break. "Fine," I said softly. "Truth or dare?" His lips curled at the corner. "Truth." I hesitated, searching for something safe. Something that wouldn't pull us deeper into whatever this was. But instead, I heard myself ask, "Have you ever wanted something you weren't supposed to have?" The moment the words left my mouth, I knew. I had cracked something open. Aiden's expression shifted, his fingers tightening slightly around his glass. The storm outside roared, rain lashing against the windows, but the silence inside the penthouse was suffocating. His eyes never left mine. "Yes," he said, voice rough. I should have left it there. Should have laughed, changed the subject, pretended I didn't hear the way his voice dropped an octave. But something reckless in me pressed forward. "What was it?" I asked. Aiden leaned forward slightly, his elbows resting on his knees. For the first time, I felt the full weight of his attention settle on me like a physical thing. "You already know," he murmured. My breath hitched. This was the moment. The moment I should have stood up, put distance between us, reminded him, and myself, of the lines that shouldn't be crossed. But I didn't move. Outside, the wind howled, shaking the glass. The power remained out, the world swallowed in darkness. And in that flickering candlelight, everything that had been unspoken between us was suddenly there, humming in the air, impossible to ignore. Aiden's gaze flickered down to my lips, then back up. I was the first to break. I stood too quickly, my pulse hammering. "I should go to bed." He didn't try to stop me, but as I turned to leave, his voice followed me, low and deliberate. "Good night," he murmured. "Try not to think about it too much." I didn't look back. I couldn't. I closed the door behind me and exhaled sharply, pressing my palms against the cool marble of the bathroom counter. My heart was still racing, my skin warm despite the chill in the penthouse. I turned the faucet on, letting the water run over my wrists, hoping the cold would settle something inside me. The storm outside hadn't quieted. The rain still hammered against the windows, the occasional crack of thunder vibrating through the walls. But in here it was just me, just silence. I needed this moment. I needed to breathe. But then, I heard it. A soft click. I froze, every muscle tensing as I caught the reflection in the mirror. Aiden. If you're enjoying the story, consider subscribing to my channel and leaving a comment about what you like or dislike. Thank you for your support. He stood in the doorway, the dim candlelight from the bedroom casting his tall frame in shadows. His expression was unreadable, but his presence alone sent a current of heat down my spine. I turned slowly, gripping the edge of the counter. Aiden. My voice came out steadier than I felt. What are you doing? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with deliberate slowness. The air felt thinner, charged with something too dangerous to name. He leaned against the door, his arms crossed loosely over his chest. You left so fast, he murmured. I wasn't sure if you were okay. I swallowed, willing my pulse to slow. I'm fine. His gaze flickered over me, lingering for half a second too long. I realized then how I must have looked, barefoot, wrapped in my silk robe, my skin still damp from the water. I don't think you are, he said. My breath caught. Aiden, you can't. He pushed off the door, stepping closer. Not close enough to touch, but close enough that I could feel the warmth radiating from him. Close enough that my body betrayed me with its awareness of him. Say it, he murmured. I shook my head, my fingers tightening around the counter. Say what? His eyes darkened. That you don't feel it. I couldn't, because we both knew it would be a lie. Aiden exhaled, running a hand through his hair, his restraint evident in the tension of his jaw. I know I shouldn't have come in here, he said, his voice lower now, almost rough. I know this is wrong. I gripped the counter harder, fighting the pull between us. Then go. He let out a short, humorless laugh. You don't want me to. I should have said yes. I should have told him to leave, to forget this, to pretend the past hour hadn't happened. But the words wouldn't come. His hand lifted slightly, as if he was about to touch me, but he stopped himself at the last second. Instead, his gaze locked onto mine, searching, waiting. The storm outside roared, rattling the glass. I should have moved. I should have said something. But I just stood there, waiting for the moment to break. And then, it did. The air was thick, humming with something unspoken, something dangerous. I could hear the storm outside, the rain pounding against the windows, the occasional rumble of thunder vibrating through the marble floors. But in here, in the candlelit confines of my bathroom, all I could focus on was him. Aiden. He was standing too close. He wasn't touching me, but his presence was pressing against me like a force of gravity. The sharp scent of his cologne lingered in the air, mixed with something deeper, something warm. I could see it in the way his chest rose and fell, in the way his jaw flexed, the tension winding through his body like a rope pulled too tight. He wasn't unaffected. And then my gaze flickered lower just for a second, just long enough to catch the unmistakable evidence of it. Heat surged through me so fast it made my breath hitch. My stomach clenched, my fingers tightening around the counter. I shouldn't have looked. But now the knowledge was there, electric in the space between us. He exhaled sharply, as if trying to steady himself, his hands flexing at his sides before clenching into fists. He was fighting it, I could see that much, fighting the tension, fighting the thoughts running through his head. This is wrong, he muttered, almost to himself. His voice was rough, thick. I swallowed hard, my pulse hammering against my ribs. Then leave. His jaw twitched. His body said one thing, but his feet didn't move. Thunder cracked outside, making the candle flame flicker wildly, sending shadows dancing across the marble. I knew I should push him back, put distance between us. I should say something sharp, something final, but my breath was coming too fast, my skin too warm despite the cool air drifting in from the hallway. Aiden's gaze flickered downward again, just for a moment, before he forced himself to look away. His fingers twitched like they wanted to reach for something, but he clenched his fists instead. "I should go," he said, his voice low, strained. But he still wasn't moving. Neither was I. The storm outside roared, the wind howled against the glass, and inside this small, flickering space something had already shifted, something neither of us could take back. Aiden exhaled sharply, his fingers tightening around the marble counter like he was bracing himself against something stronger than he could control. The dim candlelight flickered wildly, stretching his shadow along the tiled walls. He was fighting it. I could see it in the rigid set of his shoulders, the way his muscles tensed beneath his sweater, the way his jaw clenched like he was holding something back. But the proof of his struggle was there. The undeniable reaction pressing against the front of his pants. Heat coiled low in my stomach, a sharp contrast to the cool air drifting in from the hallway. My throat was dry, my heartbeat unsteady. I shouldn't have noticed. I shouldn't have let my gaze linger even for a second. But I had. And Aiden knew it. His breathing changed, slower, heavier, his eyes darkened in the flickering light, scanning my face, watching every shift, every sign of what I was thinking. I gripped the counter tighter. "Aiden," I said, barely above a whisper. "You need to—" "I know," he cut in, voice rough. He dragged a hand through his hair, shaking his head. "I know." But still, he didn't move. Neither did I. Thunder boomed outside, rattling the glass, but I barely heard it. The only thing I could focus on was the way the space between us had evaporated, how thin the air felt, how impossible it was to pretend we hadn't just crossed an invisible line. I could feel it now, the way tension had shifted into something heavier, something neither of us knew how to pull back from. Aiden's grip on the counter flexed. His fingers twitched, like he wanted to touch something, anything, to steady himself. His breathing was ragged, his pupils blown wide as they flickered to my mouth, then lower, before he caught himself and dragged his gaze back up. "I should go," he said again, but it didn't sound convincing. I swallowed hard. "Then go." His jaw tensed. I could see the war in him, the hesitation, the restraint pulling him in one direction and something darker pulling him in another. He let out a slow breath, taking half a step back. Not enough to break the tension, but enough to make me realize I'd been holding my own breath, waiting for something I shouldn't have been waiting for. Aiden shook his head, forcing his gaze away, flexing his fingers as if to rid himself of whatever thoughts were running through his mind. Then, without another word, he turned and left. The moment the door clicked shut behind him, my knees nearly buckled. I gripped the counter, forcing a breath into my lungs. My skin was burning, my mind racing. I could still feel the weight of his stare, the heat of him lingering in the air like something tangible. I had expected relief when he left. I had told myself that the moment needed to end, that he had done the right thing by walking away. But then, the door clicked open again. I froze. Aiden stepped back inside, his movements slower this time, deliberate. His face was shadowed by the dim candlelight, his expression unreadable. I should have said something. I should have stopped this before the moment unraveled any further, but my voice wouldn't come. He looked at me for a long moment, his fingers twitching at his sides. His breathing was shallow, his gaze sharp, intense. And then, he moved. Before I could react, before I could even process what was happening, he crossed the space between us. And then his mouth was on mine. Heat. That was the first thing I registered. The sheer, overwhelming warmth of him pressing against me. The way his hands found my waist, hesitant but firm. I should have pulled away. I should have stopped this before it could spiral further out of control. But I didn't. Because the moment his lips met mine, something inside me shattered. The storm outside roared, rain hammering against the glass. But inside this tiny, flickering space, everything else ceased to exist. just the heat of his mouth, the unspoken hunger behind it, the hesitation, the fear, the undeniable pull, and the realization that this was inevitable, even if we had both been pretending it wasn't. Aiden's lips were warm, urgent, yet hesitant, like he was waiting for me to stop this, waiting for a moment of restraint that never came, because I didn't pull away. Instead, my fingers curled against his sweater, gripping the fabric as if it could steady me, as if it could anchor me against the storm raging both outside and inside of me. His hand slid from my waist, slow and unsure at first, but then something shifted. His touch grew bolder, his fingers tracing the curve of my hips through the silk of my robe. The fabric was thin, barely a barrier between us, and when his palm flattened against my lower back, I felt the heat of him, solid, real, trembling with restraint. A sharp exhale left him, almost like a curse. But he didn't finish. Instead, he leaned in again, pressing his forehead against mine, his breath hot against my skin. "We can't," I whispered, even as my fingers betrayed me, tightening around him. His hands flexed against my back, as if the words physically pained him. "I know." His voice was hoarse, ragged, "but I don't care." A shiver ran down my spine, but not from the cold. His confession settled deep in my chest, a slow burning fire consuming every inch of reason I had left. The wind howled outside, rattling the glass, but the storm inside me was stronger. Aiden's lips found my jaw, slow and hesitant at first, as if he was memorizing the shape of it. Then lower, a whisper of warmth against the curve of my neck. My breath hitched, my body arching toward him before I could stop it. His hands moved then, sliding up my back, his fingers grazing the bare skin just above the tie of my robe. I should have stopped him. I should have walked away. But then his lips brushed just below my ear, and my last thread of restraint snapped. I turned my head, meeting his mouth again, this time without hesitation. Aiden groaned softly, his hands tightening against me, pulling me closer. My robe slipped slightly, the silk gliding against my skin as his fingers traced its edge. His body pressed against mine now, and I felt all of him, the undeniable evidence of just how far this had gone, of how much further it was about to go. He sucked in a sharp breath. "Tell me to stop." I couldn't, because I didn't want him to. I pressed closer instead, my lips parting against his, my fingers slipping beneath the hem of his sweater, grazing the taut skin beneath. He shuddered at the touch, his control unraveling, his body pressing me back against the cool marble counter. His hands found the tie of my robe, slowly, carefully. One pull and there would be nothing left between us, a final chance to stop this. But neither of us moved.